showed, oh, okay, the author showed that not getting a punishment was encoded the same way as getting a reward. They showed this in both the behavior and in neural data, but I will just show you briefly the behavior here. So these are the results from the learning phase on top and the transfer phase on the bottom. So just to explain you in case you are not familiar with this bar graph, but we are displaying the correct choice rate, which is on average, the average of how many times the participants chose the option with the highest expected value in each of the 4 different contexts. So from here until the end of the talk, when I'm talking about correct choice rate, it means choice towards the option with the highest expected value. And these are the results from the transfer phase. So this represents the preference of the participants for each of the symbols. So you can see that there are 2 symbols per context, and these represent the 2 symbols of each context. Now, over the participants' performance, we can see model simulations. So the absolute model would predict an encoding on an absolute scale. So the encoded reward will not be transformed. And the relative model in black predicts context dependence. And as we can see, both in the learning phase and in the transfer phase, the relative model is the best as matching participants' behavior, especially in this non-difference that we see. So participants actually learn equally from rewards and from punishments, which is not predicted by the absolute model. And especially here, where there is a value inversion, the participants on average preferred an option that made them lose more often than an option that made them win. But we're going to come back on this in more details later. In a different study published in 2017, Klein and colleagues used a slightly different version of a reinforcement learning task and showed that participants' behavior is best explained, again, by a model encoding umptuous values as a direct difference with the other outcomes. So in this task, participants went through a learning phase like this, and in the transfer phase, the options were, the context, was remodeled so that we would compare different options. Well, and these are the results. So these are the predictions of an absolute learner, and these are the predictions of a relative learner. And as we can see, the relative learner matches participants' behavior. So therefore, in the literature, there is common evidence for context-dependent learning in humans. However, these 2 studies only focus on the valence effects, so positive versus negative, but neither of them investigate the magnitude adjustments in the learning process. So in a previous publication following these papers, we adapted this task to include orthogonal manipulation of outcome balance and outcome magnitude. And we hypothesized that adding range adaptation to reference points dependence would be necessary to account for the magnitude effects in reinforcement learning. So this brings us to the last background study that I want to present you, and then we will move on to the actual paper. Yeah. Is there any questions so far? If not, I can move on. So, whoops. Yeah. Coming back to the coffee example, we are wondering how the 2 options B1 and B2 are encoded. So 2 extreme valuation systems would have opposite prediction. One might say instant coffee is instant coffee and the 2 options have the same value. But on the other side, this option was the least preferred option in the first context, so in its context, but this one was the most preferred option in its context. So one might say that we could encode values in a fully context-dependent way with one good option and one bad option in each of the different contexts. And finally, we might have a hybrid encoded, encoding, sorry, which predicts a partial contextualization of the option values. So we can see that this is decreasing, but we still have this inversion here, depending on the context in which the options were. So to compare these different valuations, we developed two versions of a classical reinforcement learning task, which manipulated balance and magnitude. The participants could either win or lose a big or a small amount of money. And we compared three main computational models which implement the three types of valuations that I just presented: absolute, which would be context independent, relative for context dependence, and hybrid for a partial contextualization. So just to give you an overview of the task, and this is also important, it's the same for the other paper. So this is what participants saw. First, there was the fixation screen, then an apparition of the two symbols or the two options. Then the participants made their choice, then the reward was displayed, and then it was the next trial. In the second experiment, we also had trials where the outcome of the unchosen option was also displayed. And I will now describe the absolute model step by step. So these would be the subjective values for each of the options, as I presented before. Then the choice would be made with the softmax function. And then the Q values, so the Q values would be updated with the prediction error when the reward is displayed. And this will also be the case when the outcome of the unchosen option is displayed on the screen. Okay, so after the learning phase, as represented here, participants went through a transfer phase where all of the options were compared in all of the possible combinations. So this one against this one, and all of them together. So importantly, in this transfer phase, we did not display any rewards, so there was no feedback because we didn't want participants to keep learning during this phase. What we want here is to have an estimation of the preference for each symbol. So we don't want participants to keep learning. All of our models use the same update rule and the same selection rule. So the difference lies in the encoding of the reward, as I said before. The absolute model encodes reward as they are seen, so they can take all of these different values, either negative, positive, and big amount, or small amount, small magnitude. The relative model uses reference points dependence and range adaptation to normalize the reward. So this model has an additional value for the context in which the context in which the options are, so that it can recognize if the reward is good or bad in its own context. So for example, in this model, a reward of 0 would have a value of 0 if it's in a gain context, but a value of 1 if it's in a loss context, because the other possible reward would be negative. So getting 0 would be, it's the best reward that you can have in this context. We can come back to this equation during the questions if you want to. And finally, the hybrid model is a weighted sum between the two extremes, the two extreme valuations, with an additional weighting parameter that goes from 0 to 1. Okay. So I will now present the results of this experiment. So in the learning phase, participants' performance is shown in pink, and model simulations are the black and white circles as I showed before. So we see that there is significant difference between high, big, and small magnitude contexts, which suggests that participants perform better when more money was at stake. The difference is represented here. And we can see that none of the two extreme models was able to match this difference. So the absolute model predicts a much bigger difference, while the relative model in black predicts no difference at all. However, the hybrid model was able to account for the magnitude effect in the learning phase. And in the transfer phase, so again, this represents the preference of the participants for each of the 8 symbols. So we can already see that visually it does look like what would the hybrid, well, it looks like a partial contextualization, as I showed you before, but it's confirmed with model simulation. So the absolute model in white predicts a linear valuation of each of the symbols, and the relative model is again binary with a good option and a bad option in each of the contexts. But the hybrid model is the only one to match participants' behavior, especially this inversion here, which is the key results, the key behavioral results of this paper, where the participants preferred an option that made them lose more often than an option that made them win, which I think is quite neat. So when we analyzed the distribution of the weighting parameter, which varies from the absolute model, I mean a full absolute valuation to a full relative or context-dependent valuation, and we looked at participants' performance as a function of their weight parameter. And we found a positive correlation in the learning phase and a negative correlation in the transfer phase, which suggests that relative valuation leads to better performance in the learning phase, but to more irrational choices in the transfer phase. So the irrational choices, again, I'm going to use this term a lot, but it's to define the inversion that I've shown you. Irrational choices in the sense that participants preferred an option with the lowest expected value, sometimes one that would make them lose when compared to a higher expected value. So finally, for the presentation of this study, since the 2 extreme models have the same number of parameters, we can directly compare the likelihood. And when we look at the evolution of this difference across the task time, as shown here, we see that participants seem to encode values on an absolute scale at the beginning of the task and then progressively switch to relative valuation over the task time. Yeah, so we have this dynamic encoding, or this dynamic context dependence over the task time. And we tested, as I said briefly before, 2 different versions of the task. So in one of them, all of the trials were with partial feedback, so participants would only see the reward of the options, the chosen option. And in experiment 2, in half of the trials, they could also see the reward of the unchosen option. And this is what we see. So when we compare the likelihoods in both of the tasks, we see that relative valuation is stronger in the second one, which is the one where participants had more information on the outcomes. So to conclude this study, the conclusions is that our results show evidence for partial contextualization, which increases performance in the learning phase, but leads to more irrational preferences when the options are extrapolated from their original context, so in the transfer phase. We found that this process, progressively arises during learning and is stronger when the outcome identification is facilitated. These conclusions come with 2 subsequent questions. First, can we develop a model that would dynamically encode range adaptation? And second, can we influence context dependence by manipulating the task factors which facilitate the identification of the option's objective value? And this finally brings us to the paper. So again, if there is any question, please do not hesitate to ask them.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Yes.
I cannot understand why should we run an experiment with both partially and fully information conditions simultaneously. Can you explain it? Why is it needed?
You mean having both partial and complete trials within the same experiment? So I think since this paper directly follows Stefano's paper from 2015, where they had this 2x2 design manipulating balance and information. So information being partial feedback or complete feedback. So already in these experiments, the same participants would go through well, partial and complete feedback. So I think this is why we did it like this in this study. And it was also to have this manipulation within subjects so that the same participants would have to go through both types of trials. But in the next paper that I'm going to show you, we did everything between subjects. So we didn't have the two types of trial. The participants would either have partial feedback or complete feedback. And I'm going to show you this in a minute.
Okay, because I asked this question because the partial feedback in some situations has a different effect on the human preference and human response time. So it was a bit unclear for me. Thank you.
Yes, but also, yeah, so the partial feedback also forces participants to explore more, right? Since in the complete feedback, you already have both of the options, then the learning might be, I mean, at least it's easier, might be faster because you don't have to explore. So yeah, I guess it's two different types of learning. But what we can predict here is that when you have complete feedback, you actually, so what we want to show in this study of 2018 is that participants start the experiment not knowing which context is which. And when you progressively have information on the context in which the options are, so when you can recognize that you are, for example, in a loss context, then you know that not having a reward is actually positive in the encoding. Because the other alternative would be losing points. And so, yeah, so this is why we predict that if we facilitate the outcome identification, so if we have a complete feedback situation, then the context dependence will be higher or stronger. Actually, because you identify more quickly that you are in a loss context. I don't know if it makes sense, but
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, to answer.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can I? Sorry. Can I ask one question before we go further? I want to just be sure that I completely get the experiment. In these experiments, in these papers, I think, could you please go to page number 19 or 20 when you were explaining the experiment?
Before this?
Yes.
This one maybe?
This one is good. Sorry. Each one of these stimuli icons, we show all of them in different contexts, and after in transfer phase, we show items in different contexts to experiment to people for them to compare these. It's okay. It's like this. Okay, I'm saying it right?
Yes.
But it's somehow it's vague for me. You per se real world example between coffees that in different contexts. I don't want to overgeneralize it to the real world, but it's sometimes vague for me how these experiments it's towards that example. I mean, how we exactly define context and stimuli, and we compare them. It's a little vague for me. Could you please explain it again or in more detail?
Yeah, so if I understand your question, you are asking how our result could be interpretable in the real world, right? So the
Yes.
coffee example was actually just a toy example
to
explain the core idea of what we are doing. So in our task, the context is really just a pair of symbols. Yes. And then, I mean, it's the problem with many psychological tasks, right? That we are trying to investigate something so specific that we can't really give a real world example. But here, I mean, there are situations where you have to adapt to the environment that is around you, and then if you go out, then it's difficult to, I mean, you would have to readapt to another environment. For example, it's not about learning, but say if you are in a room that is very dark, then your sight is going to adapt to the lack of light so that you can still see some shapes and you can move around in the room without being completely lost. And then if you go out and it's a bright day, then at first you will have trouble adjusting. And then after a few seconds or a few minutes, then your eyes will adjust again to this new environment. So I don't know if it makes sense, but
yes.
Yeah. Also, so I'm giving these examples of visual perception. It doesn't really apply to reinforcement learning, but yeah.
No, I just wanted to be sure about the experiment. I know we have this problem. We cannot generalize it completely to the real world. We have to narrate that. Thank you a lot.
Yeah. So just to be clear, a context is a pair of options. Okay. I'm going to re-explain this in my introduction of this paper that we published. So here again, okay, so we want to answer the questions of, is it possible to have a model that dynamically encodes context dependence over the task time? And two, is it possible to manipulate this context dependence, or at least the strengths of context dependence, if we change the task design? So if we change the factors of the task. I'm going to show you this in a minute. So to answer these questions, we developed an online-based task which was performed by 800 participants and which does not include punishments anymore. So we've only varied the magnitudes. Participants could win either 10 points in the two blue contexts or 1 point in the two green contexts. Okay, so in the learning phase, we have 4 different contexts. Then in the transfer phase, instead of comparing all possible combinations of symbols, we actually reshaped the context so that we would directly compare the 2 good or the 2 best options of the 10 points and 1 point, the 2 worst options of 10 points and 1 point, the best option of 10 points versus the worst option of 1 point. And more interestingly, the worst option of 10 points and the best option of 1 point. Okay, so I'm saying that this is the most interesting because if you encode values on an absolute scale, then you would always choose this one because it has the highest expected value. But if you encode values on a relative scale or a context-dependent scale, then you will always choose this one because it was the most favorable option of its learning context. Okay, so I hope that this design is clear. If not, let me know. But I'm not hearing anything, so I guess it's fine. So we had 8 different versions of this task to manipulate the difficulty of the experiment. So the trials could be either interleaved, as shown on the left, or in blocks, as shown on the right. The feedback information could be either partial or complete, as I explained before, and the transfer phase could be either without feedback, as we had done until now, or with feedback, because we wanted to see if it was possible to actually revert these irrational choices. So if we had feedback in the transfer phase, then the participants can keep learning, and maybe they will be able to adjust their choices with and to keep learning with this addition of feedback. Okay, so to show you the results of the learning phase, this is what we obtained. So we can see the learning curves on the left and the average performance on the right. So again, the correct choice rate is the rate of choices towards the option with the highest expected value. And we can see that there is a difference in performance, a difference between the high magnitude context and the low magnitude context, which replicates the findings that we had before, that the participants perform better when more money is at stake. Now in the transfer phase, so remember this time, we don't have an estimation for each symbol. We have a correct choice rate for each of the 4 reshaped contexts. And this is what we found. And I want to draw your attention to this performance here in the last context that I showed you, where on average participants were below chance level, which means that on average, they have chosen the option with the lowest expected value, which is what we expected from the previous literature and the previous study that I presented you. Oops. Okay, so we looked at each of the 8 experiments separately, especially in the learning phase that will be shown on the left, and in this last key context that will be shown on the right. So remember that the factors that we manipulated were the order of the trials, which could be either interleaved or in blocks, the amount of feedback information, which could be either partial or complete, and whether or not feedback was provided in the transfer phase. So we expected that in experiment 7, which had block trials, complete feedback, the performance would be the highest, but then the learning performance would be the highest because it's the easiest version of the task. But the performance in this key context would be the lowest because, as I said, if it's easier to recognize the context, then it will lead to more irrational choices. And the results actually confirmed our predictions that this is the highest, well, this is the experiment with the highest learning performance and the lowest performance in the key context. And what we can also see from this figure here is that the only experiments where participants were able to adjust their preferences, adjust their choices in this key context, was experiment 8, where it was so that they did have feedback in the transfer phase, and it was the easiest experiment. So adding feedback did not allow participants to adjust their choices in all of the different versions of the task, only in this one, which was the easiest possible that we could think of, which is also quite interesting. So next, I'm going to show you some model simulations results. So we compared mainly two reinforcement learning models. So the absolute model, which is again the same one that I've been presenting before without modification, and the range model, which is a dynamic version of the hybrid model. So the range, oh, sorry. So the selection rule is the same, update rule as well, but it's the encoding of the reward that is different. So the range model tracks in each context a maximum reward and a minimum reward, and that are updated also with this prediction. I mean, with this rule of a difference between what we have and what we thought we would have. So the model tracks maximum and minimum rewards for each context, updates them depending on the reward, and then the reward is normalized using a range adaptation rule. So this way, the values are progressively learned from an absolute valuation when we don't know the maximum and the minimum rewards to a relative valuation, and then in the end should be between 0 and 1 in each context. So this is the key equation here.
Sorry, the Rmax is the maximum reward, which is seen during the whole experiment, or in just that trial.
So it's the Rmax is
Rmax and Rmin.
Yes.
Are for the whole experiment or not?
So yes, I mean, it's for each context. So there will be, we have 4 contexts in the learning phase and 4 contexts in the transfer phase. So there will be a total of 8 values for, I mean, there will be a vector of 8 values for the Rmax and Rmin. So they are updated at each trial, but for each context. So they last during the whole task, but they are only updated when it's the specific context. Okay. So I'm going to show you the model simulations. Again, comparing the model predictions in white for the absolute model and in black for the range model over participants' behavior that you've already seen. And as you can see, both in the learning phase and the transfer phase, the range model is actually better at predicting participants' behavior or participants' performance, especially in this small magnitude context from the learning phase, where the absolute model predicts a bigger difference. So this is very similar to what I've shown you from the previous study with the purple bars. And here, especially again in this key context, the range model is the only one to be able to account for these irrational choices in this context, where the absolute model is not able to have performances under chance level, which would be 0.5. So to sum up, the absolute model was not able to match participants' behavior, and the range model was actually able to predict it quite accurately. Okay, so now one thing that we might say, or say one limitation of this model that is a full range adaptation with Rmax and Rmin is that since we don't really have, I mean, we don't have negative rewards in this task. So the Rmin, which is initialized to 0, would never change because the minimum reward that you can have over the whole task is always 0. So why are we using Rmax minus Rmin and not just the Rmax? Well, one argument that we have for this is that we have fitted and simulated this model, this range model, on the previous data set, so the one from 2018, just to see if it was able to work in context where there was negative rewards as well. And as you can see from these simulations, so I could have explained this better, but we are comparing a model that just divides the reward with the R max, and a model that does the range adaptation as I shown you before. So the range adaptation is in black and the R max is in white. And in the previous data sets, well, we need this actual range adaptation, and not just maximum adaptation to match participants' behavior, because we have negative rewards as well. But it is true that in our task from this paper of 2021, we could do the normalization only with the R max, because the R min would never differ from 0. So finally, we split participants across their model likelihood. So either the absolute model, either the participants would be better explained by an absolute model or a range adaptation model. And we looked at their correct choice rates in the learning phase and in the transfer phase. And we were again able to replicate the findings that we had from the previous paper, where participants that were best explained by a range model had a higher performance in the learning phase, but a worse performance in the transfer phase, explained by a higher number of irrational choices in this phase. So we can say that again, range adaptation is locally adaptive in the learning phase, but when we look at the average money won in the experiments, because participants were actually paid with the number of points that they received, well, in this case, the range model would predict less money won. So the range model is able to kind of predict the money that was actually won by participants. So this is the average for the whole task, and this is the split between the learning phase and the transfer phase. And we see that this average money was not only best explained by the range model, but it was also smaller than the one predicted by the absolute model in white, which suggests that this range adaptation, although it's being locally adaptive in the learning phase, it is also disadvantageous. It doesn't pay out on the long run, or at least that it's not optimal in our task. Yes, so to conclude this study, found that context-dependent effects were replicated in a large-scale online experiment with 800 participants. So by the way, it was 100 participants per experiment, didn't mention that. Which the counterintuitive additional effect that the factors that actually increase performance during the learning phase also undermine the performance in the transfer phase. Oops. So we did propose a satisfactory range adapting model, which dynamically normalizes the values as a function of the range of the available option values. And we showed that despite being locally adaptive, at least in our task, range adaptation is economically disadvantageous. So these are the conclusions of this study. And if I have enough time, but I think I do, I would also like to show you the follow-up study that we have done with Stefano to address one of the limitations that I mentioned about this range adaptation model. So let me know if you want me to stop there, or if I have time. It's going to be brief, but just in case, I think it's good. Okay. Okay, so I've told you, so these are the results that I've just shown you from the paper, with the easy pair of the transfer phase and the key context of the transfer phase with the irrational choices. And as I told you in this task, it's not really possible to, well, participants' behavior can be explained by this simple model of dividing the actual reward with the maximum reward of the context. But it is arguable that it could also be explained by other types of normalization, and among them, two main theories, which are the range adaptation, as we just saw, and divisive normalization, where the reward is not divided by the range or the maximum, but it's divided by the sum of all of the possible options. So the limitation is that in this task, as in many two-armed bandit tasks, it's not really possible to clearly differentiate between these types of normalization, because here, well, the minimum doesn't change, and also there are only two options. So to design a task in which the two types of normalization would have clearly different predictions, we turn to three-armed bandit as represented here. So here, there were 4 different contexts, and we varied the number of options from binary options, binary choice, so choosing between 2 options, or trinary choosing between 3 options. So the numbers that you see are the mean of the distributions that the outcomes were drawn from, and comparing choices between 2 options and choices between 3 options, will allow us to differentiate between the 2 types of normalization, because the range is the same between binary and trinary, but the sum of the options will be completely different. It will be higher when there are 3 options. After this learning phase, participants always also went through a transfer phase, which was similar to the first one that I showed you. So we did not show any feedback, and there were all of the possible combinations so that we could have a preference of the participants for each of the 10 different symbols. Just to show you that the 2 types of normalization will actually have different predictions. So the range adaptation would predict something like this in the transfer phase, with all of the highest options of each context having similar predictions, whether it's the 86 or the 50. So the 50 being the best option, it will be closer to 1, then the middle option at 50, and then the lowest option around, I don't know, 0.2 or something, but all of them will have the same value. So there is a mistake here, it should say 14. Now, divisive normalization, on the other hand, will have these types of prediction. So as I told you before, since we compare context with 2 options and context with 3 options, well, this option here will have a lower value because it's divided by a higher number. So this is what a divisive normalization model would predict. Okay, now the results. So first of all, the behavioral results. We had this experiment done in 3 different versions by a total of 150 participants, which was also online. And this is what we observed. So you can see the learning curves on the left, the performance or the correct choice rate. So again, the choice is towards the option with the highest expected value in the learning phase, and the preferences, so the choice rate in the transfer phase. And we can already see that it kind of seems to resemble range adaptation and not divisive normalization. At least we don't have this slope here that would predict a higher valuation for the blue options compared to the brown ones, as represented here. So already we have some kind of visual evidence that divisive normalization might not be the right model here. But to be sure, we have to fit these models and do the simulations to see which one of the two would be the best at matching participants' behavior. So this is what we did. And we see that the range model above compared to the divisive model below seems to be the best one at matching participants' behavior. So although both models are not doing a bad job at matching participants' behavior in the learning phase, it seems clearer in the transfer phase that the range adaptation model is more adapted to fit participants' behavior, especially as I showed you in the difference between these options there, whereas the divisive model seems to be completely lost at matching participants' behavior. So from this, and also the quantitative measures such as the BIC or the out of sample log likelihood also favor the range adaptation model compared to the divisive normalization model. So here we have some robust evidence against divisive normalization. However, we are still not quite happy with the simulations of the range adaptation. So as you can see, it's better than divisive normalization, but it's still not quite adapted, especially the middle options here that are completely missed by our range adaptation model. So what we thought from these results is that maybe there was some kind of attentional effect, if I can say, which would suggest that participants put more importance in the highest, in the best option, so the highest with the expected value, and then the two other options seem to be more disregarded. Something like this would not be predicted by a linear range adaptation model, which would be like this, so 1, 0.50, but it could be predicted by a model that is nonlinear, so that would be like the range adaptation, but with a curved parameter that would allow participants to put more importance on the best option. So this is what we did. And these are the simulations of this nonlinear range model that doesn't really have a name yet. But see, we added this additional power parameter that will allow the normalization to be nonlinear. And as you can see, it is much better at matching participants' behavior. We now have a descriptive model that predicts the observed pattern of nonlinear range adaptation. And finally, the last thing that I want to show you is this. So something that I didn't tell you in the task design is that participants went through a learning phase, they went through a transfer phase, and they also went through a scale phase, where we asked them to explicitly give the average value of each of the symbols. So this will give us another way of getting participants' preferences. And instead of being choice-based, like this phase, this will be scale-based. So participants could directly express their valuation of each of the symbols. And this is what we observe. So these are the results from this phase. Again, for the 10 different options, and the scale-based ratings are shown on the y-axis, averaged over the 150 participants. The actual true objective value of the option is shown in the shaded red rectangles. And as we can see here, there is already the same pattern as before, where the values of the options does not depend on the number of options in each context, but more of a within context valuation. And it's even more clear when, when we look at the difference between the subjective value that was expressed by the participants and the objective value that is shown in red. So we see that there is kind of a regression to the mean for the 86 and the 14 options that is unchanged by the number of options. But crucially, the difference for option 50 is completely determined by its position in the range. and not by the total sum of the available options. So finally, just to compare the two methods, the two elicitation methods, so either the scale-based or the choice-based that we've already seen, we see that these the pattern look very similar. And just to make sure, we took the values that were explicitly given in the scale-based ratings by the participants and simulated transfer phase based on these values. And this is what we observed. So as you can see, the simulations almost perfectly match participants' behavior, which shows that both methods are a good way to estimate participants' subjective valuations in our task. So now I think I'm done with my presentation. Of course, I'd like to thank Stefano, which is my former supervisor, and my co-authors, Maëlle Le Breton and Aldo Rusticchini. Of course, thank you all for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much for your great presentation, Sophie. And everyone, any questions? Amir.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I have multiple questions. First of all, I'm not sure if the range model can predict some additive conditions. For example, consider a condition that we have two contexts. One context with, for example, 0 and 0.1 options, and one condition, one context with a 100 and 100.0. So these two contexts are very different, but I think the range model predicts the same behavior for both conditions, for both contexts. If
yes.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if the model predicts correctly. Can you explain your opinion about how to solve this problem?
So that's a good question. I actually don't know what the participants' behavior would be. So if you have any reference of if this task, I'm sure that this task has already been done, but if you have a reference for this, I would be very happy to go check this, because so you are right in saying that the range adaptation would predict the same behavior in the two contexts, but I'm not sure if participants' behavior would actually be different. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Actually.
But so the context would be 0, 0.1, and 100, 100.1, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, even the absolute model would predict the same behavior, right? Because the difference in option values is the same in both contexts. Yes, well, I don't know if you have really if you know of a paper that has done this experiment. I would be very curious to read the results.
Yeah. It was interesting for me to know the result of this condition, and comparing this condition with your contexts, and because the puzzle will be complete if this context will be studied.
So maybe something that could answer partly this question is that in this project, so I've only actually showed you half of the results. We have another half, so of these results where these, okay, so we had this design for 150 participants, and another one where these narrow range actually go from 86 to 50. So maybe, so it's not as big as a difference as comparing 0.1 and 100, but maybe this can kind of answer your question. And we don't see any difference in participants' behavior. So again, this is within subjects, but we don't see any difference in participant behavior when there is a context from 14 to 50 and from 50 to 86. So maybe this can partly answer your question. I don't know.
The problem is that the relative difference between two options in one context is big enough to compare and make a decision. But sometimes, for example, in a context that you go to shop and you are comparing two shares, which have, for example, $1,000 and $1,001, the difference is like this situation. Making a decision is hard, and learning in this situation is hard.
So, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So that's a good question.
Okay. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. It was very, very fruitful for me.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Amir. Any questions? Okay, Arash, please.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I learned a lot. Just a general wondering, in this kind of task, we have a context and some stimuli, and participant learns it, and we test them in a completely new context that they haven't been exposed with, some new context with something completely new. But just to, I want to think of a new experiment that we have a context not completely new. We have some features of, for example, context A and context B, a combination of these that people can examine the similar wide features. I mean, like this. I'm not going to say a real world example, but I want you to think of this. When we go that coffee example, we want a coffee in, I don't know, work or home. There are similarity between contexts. They are not completely new. I didn't go to a new world and order a coffee. I mean, can we change context that be a combination of the previous context and not something that they completely have to learn from base? Do we have such experiments or not at all?
So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you are asking. So here, for example, so going from these four learning contexts to this transfer phase, so it's a new context in the sense that these two options have not been compared before. However, participants still have, I mean, it's not completely new in the sense that they still have a value for each option, right? So maybe could you repeat the last part of your question?
Let me tell it like this. What if we have some context that have some effects on some stimuli? The stimuli, for example, the symbols by themselves don't have any value or something else. The context give them some value like this, but these symbols repeat themselves in different contexts. I mean, maybe I'm saying it very badly.
So the symbols would not have a value. It would just be the context
that changed.
that keeps it. So say, for example, so visually, you could have the same pair of blue versus pink and say have a different background color, for example.
Yes, we define context like the background and size of the rectangle, the base rectangle. And these features describe the context and change the value of the symbols. And we start to examine them like this. For example, our new context would be a combination of the colors and the size of rectangles. I mean, we define the context by features and divide them by features. Is it possible, or it's completely out of context?
I think it's possible to do. I'm not sure how the learning could. I think it could be very hard to learn from the participants. So because here, like the main, we are able to answer these questions because each of the symbols has its own value, and what changes is, so what we call the context, so what changes is the pair, right? And so if you have the same pair and the value change, I'm not sure what we could. So okay, maybe I might be wrong here, but I'm predicting that since in our range adaptation model, what is important is the maximum and the minimum rewards. I'm guessing that even if you change the context, but you keep the background context, but you keep the same symbols, then these two values will still change because they are not. So okay. So say if we keep the model as it is, I think that this could be still possible to model this range adaptation. So again, I don't know what the participants' behavior could be because I'm not sure how the learning in which way it's going to go, but I think it could be at least modeled still with this model. But then maybe there could be a difference because, as I said, this maximum and minimum values depend on the context. So I guess we would need to, maybe if you want to change the background context and not the pair of option, make them depending on the pair of option. And this way, even if you change the values, then it will be able to adapt. I think, well, I might be wrong, but from what I understand of your question, I think.
Thank you very much. I get it. Excuse me if I'm saying I'm not very clear about my question. This is my problem. The reason why I think about this is because I see this behavioral result as some strategies. Maybe we have a new context, a very new context that you kind of shocked. If you see this, you just omit one of your strategies that you have to omit the context strategy. I mean, something like this. I want to be, if there is a similarity, how we can change it. The reason I was thinking about the experiment was this. Thank you for presentation and your answer. It was very good.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, Sophie, thank you so much for your great presentation. It was really interesting. Yeah. I think we can finish the meeting. Okay, thank you. Bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you all. Thanks again for the invitation. Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day.